Welcome to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, Container Gardening with Native Plants, presented by Mervyn Wallace. I'm Sarah Jones with the library, and we're going to get started here in a moment, but I want to remind you that you don't have to have a library card or even be a resident of St. Louis County to attend our virtual or in-person programs. We hope you enjoy yourself, you learn something new, and share that with your family and friends. And then you can recommend that they check out the recording of tonight's program or many of our programs on our YouTube channel, which I'll share the link for that and everything else I mentioned here in a moment in the chat. And so you're welcome to share the things that you learn with us anytime. You can find more about the library programs at www.slcl.org/events. But tonight's program is a part of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series. The St. Louis County Library is thrilled to be a partner as host for these webinars. And they have many upcoming events in addition to this 10-part series. We're on night 3 or session 3. But they will also have an in-person workshop and plant sale on April 15th from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center. And there'll be a native plant fair with Beyond Housing on April 30th as well. As I said, there'll be a link for those things in a moment. The next programs in the webinar series that we'll be hosting are Transforming a Yard from Invasives to Natives with Carrie Coyne of St. Louis Community College. That'll be tomorrow at Wednesday, March 15th at 2 p.m. And then next Tuesday night, you can join us for a program about rainscaping solutions. That's with Earthway Center at Mobot and as well as MSD's Project Clear. So those are the next two, and you can register for those or any of our programs by going to the library's website. And as I mentioned, tonight's program and many of our programs are recorded, and you can check those out on our YouTube channel. The links for all these things, as I mentioned, will be in the chat here in a moment, along with a very important thing, a survey that will help give Partners for Native Landscaping some feedback about tonight's webinar and allow us to have good information for next year's planning. So we appreciate you taking some time at some point to fill that out. So thank you for that. All right, so now the important part, the reason why we're all here tonight, all the many of us. I'd like to introduce you to this evening's presenter, Mervyn Wallace. Mervyn graduated from the School of the Ozarks with a BS degree in biology in 1968. The following year, he studied botany at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and his work history includes teaching high school biology, chemistry, and general science for 3 years, followed by 10 years as a laboratory technician in the Missouri State Public Health Laboratory Virology Unit. In 1984, he started Missouri Wildflowers Nursery with the purpose of providing native plants the genetic origin from within the state of Missouri. 38 years later, the nursery continues to strive to keep up with the demand for native plants that are naturally selected by their environment. So with all of that wonderful background and experience, we are so delighted to have you with us this evening, Mervyn. I'll turn things over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. And I hit share.
You hit share. All right, we see you. Perfect.
Okay, okay, I think we got it. And if I hit that, yep, we're on it. Yeah, so I'm talking about container gardening. And as I've been preparing for this recently, I've been wondering about who wants to grow plants in containers. And that leads me back to me being a plant person by the time I was 10 years old, I've always said, which I've come to the realization that there are, we can divide people into other groups than political, but plant people or non-plant people. And I would guess that everybody in the audience that's really listening to this is a plant person. But maybe there are a few that aren't, and maybe there's a spouse or a kid there that isn't. But anyway, not all plant people are native plant people. And many of the plant people for years they didn't know anything about growing natives, and then they got into it. So there's that group. But a person who doesn't own property hopefully can have some plants, potted plants outdoors. Many of the plant people have property, and they're growing plants in gardens and of all kinds, and probably in pots also. But it's those that don't have the property to grow the plants on. They may be using containers outdoors on the porch. I mean, obviously, a lot of people grow plants inside, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the native plants. Just somebody's going to ask that, and I don't know of any native plant that really works indoors at this point. We've tried a few. They make it. I've had one make it through the winter, but it didn't really do all that well. Anyway, we're going to move on. Oh, a couple of things about the presentation as we go. I've put a lot of pictures in here, and I've got names and dates, and occasionally I'm going to stray from the subject and talk about the pictures, and the dates are important, and it's nice that the date is there in my camera when I take a picture, because that's how I come up with these. Non-natives in pots usually look really nice and bloom all summer, and spring, summer, and fall even. And the color is provided by flowers and also leaves. But the natives in pots they have a time during the year when they bloom, most of them. And there's a few that will bloom for a long period, and we're going to look at a couple of those in a little bit. And the most important, they can last for years in the pots, and that's a big difference between those and the annual bedding plants that are not native. So we're going to be talking about plants with holes. I'm sorry, pots with holes and pots without holes or no holes. Those no holes increase the number of plants that you can grow in containers if you use those also. And we're going to talk about how to make one of those in a little bit. I'm going to talk about this picture for just a minute on the left. If there's somebody in the audience that's really good at their identification and you see this as a different species, we won't talk about it now, but feel free to contact me at some time in the future, and we'll chat about it. Sorry, I'm distracted by something at the top of my screen that no one else is seeing probably, but I'm going to continue. Most natives are perennial. I've said that, and I'll probably say it one more time, and they will last for years outside in containers, including through the winter. And we're going to see several examples of this. The plant here is American spikenard, and I had no idea that you could grow a plant that big in a pot, and it's obviously in a big pot. But this was at Shaw Nature Reserve in 2014, and since then I've been growing American spikenard in a pot about that same size and with good success. Which brings up sometimes, well, the pots, when it's warming up in the spring, the pots will be warmer than the ground, and so the plants in the pot may get started growing earlier than they are in the ground. And so that happened to the American spikenard I had a couple of years ago in a pot. It got up there and it got severely frozen with a late frost. So you might keep that in mind. I've made a few generalizations over time about growing natives, and I'm going to repeat something here, but anyway, some native plants can look good in a pot all year, and grasses and sedges are a good example, and I'm going to show you a few of those. Few natives will bloom as long as exotic annual bedding plants do, but there's some that will really give them a challenge. And again, some native perennials can last years in pot. And probably the most important thing here is that big pots are heavy and hard to move. So when you set one up, you ought to try not to move it very often, if at all. When it comes to choosing plants, almost every plant that I've tried in a pot works. However, I've had failures and had some that struggle. And this year I'm rethinking the potting soil, which we're going to talk about more. I think my failures may be due a lot to that, and maybe I can get more of them to survive if I can figure out the potting soil. The mature size of the plant is important. This rock pink is very small, and the American spikenard is very large, so you have to have a pot accordingly. You could have a big pot with rock pink in it. It would just in a few years cover the whole surface of it because it seeds in very well. Rock pink is one of those plants that will bloom from June when it starts until September. And the other one that I was going to say that blooms a long time is star tick seed. It's Coreopsis pubescens. I don't have a picture of it though. Now, when you're choosing plants, don't be limited by my list. Experiment. And you're wondering, well, what about this list? This list has got a front and back side, and it, I assume, has been sent to you in an email with your link, as I understand it. So you might look for that, and if you don't find it, I guess you'll have to complain to someone, me if nothing else. Short-lived perennials are short-lived in pots. And cardinal flower is pretty well known that it doesn't live a long time, but it doesn't keep people from buying it and trying it. If you had it in the ground, in a bed, I would suggest in the fall taking a rake and stirring up the soil around the base of the plant at the time when it's dropping seeds. And hopefully it will reseed into that location. I've heard this works, but I haven't tried it. We're going to see fire pink again. We're going to change gears here and look at the actual containers for a minute with holes. And they, I use the first two on this list mostly. The shiny glazed pots, I'm going to skip down to the next one here and go back. This is a clay pot. It's porous, and it's been fired to about 2000 degrees or somewhere around there, and that makes it become a ceramic. You can put it in water and it won't dissolve. It's fragile, it'll break, but it's porous, and pretty much they look like the dirt that they were made out of, the clay. But you take that same clay pot and put a coating of glazing material on it and then fire it back up to almost the same temperature that it was before. And that glazing material makes a glass-like surface that's pretty much impervious to water. Plastic pots and metal and wood are some other kinds. And let's see. Oh, the clay pots are often made in Mexico, and you can seal them with a terracotta sealer, which I didn't do with this plant, and I've had it for 17 years in that pot. The plant I've had in there is the leather flower. It's a vine, and it's not showing in this picture. It's not up yet. The sand phlox, though, is no longer there, but the sedum is still hanging in. We're going to take a look at this pot later when I added dirt to the bottom this year as part of the maintenance. This is a wooden pot at Shaw Nature Reserve. They change the plants in it, I think, every year or so. The 2015 one on the left, you can see it looks a little better than the one on the right. This is just made out of a log that has been a section of a log that's hollow. Making use of something that would otherwise just disintegrate over time. So let's talk about potting soil. I've got up here in big red. This is my message for the year. I'm not sure about potting soil. What you ought to use. This plant you're looking at here, the Indian pink, is in real dirt. It's on Carol David's front porch, and I've seen it. It's about 4 years old, I think, 3 or 4. I've seen it almost every year, once each year, and I'm always amazed at how much larger it is. And it started out as just a little seedling put in the pot. So I'm beginning to think that real dirt may be the direction to go, or modify it some. At least I think that the potting soil ought to contain real soil in it, mineral dirt. This is what we use and have used. I've used this. I'm sorry, this is the potting soil that we use to grow the plants in that we sell. And it's about 1/3 rice hulls, 1/3 pine bark, and 1/3 compost. And it's got a little bit of turfus. And the turfus is a clay, baked clay particles that are ground down small to about 1/4 inch in diameter at the most. And that's what you see in this picture here. Sometimes we add limestone for the plants that we grow in the containers that we sell. And those are usually the glade species like purple beard tongue and Missouri primrose. And they do really well with the added limestone. Please don't use peat moss when you're making a mix. And the reason, I mean, we use very little of it, but because we haven't come up with a substitution, mainly for covering seeds when we put them in containers. But peat moss is it's a carbon sink, just like coal and oil. So when we dig it out of the ground and burn it to heat homes, as they do in some countries, or here mix it in soil, or using it as amendments, or make potting soil out of it, pretty soon it's disintegrated and has put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So here's a plant that is causing me to rethink the potting soil. This is a cedar sedge that was really doing poorly this spring, still is. I was going through and repotting a bunch of, I've gone through about half my pots and added soil to the bottoms of the ones that need it. You don't add it to the top when you do it, but this one, cedar sedge, grows on glades, limestone glades. So I've filled this pot up to about where the red line is, where it changes from brown to red, about that height. And then I put the real dirt mix with a little bit of potting soil in it, and then I've got the plant on top. I really hope to see it perk up this year, but it's a learning process. But this is a plant, another cedar sedge, different shaped pot, and that's all I can say about it. It's still got the same potting soil, and it's going gangbusters. It's got they spread by underground runners, and it's coming up at the edge of the pot. You can see closest to you. What about fertilizer? Plants in pots are in a closed system, unless they get the root out through the bottom of the pot and into the soil underneath. They're relying on you for fertilizer. We have to fertilize the plants that we sell at the nursery, and that's a big thing. One of the ways we know they need fertilizer is that the foliage begins to turn yellow. Now, I have a deceiving picture here. That plant is not needing fertilizer. That's a smoke tree. that was on a really nice morning, and a Sunday morning when no one else was around, had the opportunity to take pictures of it backlit, and it turned out pretty good, I thought. You've read about through the kinds of fertilizer here now, so it doesn't matter what you choose. If you're used to using fertilizer, work with what you're familiar with, what works for you. If you're not, and you choose one of these, go easy. Don't follow the instructions, but don't go overboard and put too much on, because if you do, it has the same effect as putting salt on the soil and will kill the plant. So now, to divert from the message here for just a second, this is that smoke tree that in the big pot. We've moved it once. It's big and heavy, and it took about 3 people to get it moved. The foliage on the left is what the leaves really look like, not that yellow like you saw in the previous picture. And then in the fall, they turn yellow, like you see on the picture on the right. They can also turn orange and a little bit of red in them. And mulch. Mostly mulch is for appearance. I put this not weed control in here, but if I'm using real dirt, I may begin to think about using a little mulch on to knock the weeds back, but we'll see. It's not really to hold moisture and not really to cool the soil, but it's mostly just for looks. I did mulch some pots in 2009, obviously, and took a picture, and that's what you see there. But whatever you want to work with is fine if you want to put some on the surface. And what about watering? Don't follow a set schedule. If you do, you're going to have them too wet or too dry, probably. So you need to think about, well, first of all, transpiration is the process by the way that water makes it up from the roots through the stems and out through the leaves. And that happens all the time during the daytime. The little openings in the leaves that the water gets out of, they're staying open most of the time. So on a cloudy day, transpiration is slower than on a sunny day. Rainy days, it hardly happens at all. It's movement of water from a high concentration to a low concentration. And when it's concentrated outside, not much goes on. Wind has an effect also. Small pots dry faster than large ones. Keep that in mind. And there's large plants or plants with large leaves. They're going to lose water probably faster in most cases than the ones with small leaves. And then, of course, there's plants just adapted to dry locations. When you thoroughly water, though, because if you water a small amount and it only goes down, say, 2 or 3 inches in a 7 or 8 inch deep pot, you're going to end up with a drastically dry area down in the bottom and the moisture on top, and that can happen in the summertime easily if you're not careful. So you need to get a feel for how much moisture you need, and when in doubt, overwater it and it'll dry out pretty quick. Just don't do it every day. You can stick your finger in the soil and see if it's dry. That's one way. If it's a pot that you can pick up the side of it and get a feel for whether it's light or heavy due to the amount of water, that's one way of doing it. Now I've got a word here about drip irrigation. This picture was taken in Boise, Idaho, on a person's front porch. He had lots of plants scattered around beyond this location. So I'm taking the picture from under the porch in a chair probably and looking out. You can't see all the drip lines on the back side of these pots, and it wasn't unsightly on the other side, but they were there. Boise is in a desert, even though you see a lot of green grass and trees here. It's really dry there. The humidity is low. And so it's really a great advantage to have a drip irrigation there. And the climate is a little more, the weather is a little more predictable. It's going to be dry every day. So your plants are going to need lots of water. Here, it varies. So you got to keep that in mind. Now we need to talk about winter care. Keep the pots outside on the ground, on concrete, not up in the air on a table. And don't water them very often, and they'll keep through the winter pretty good. In other words, don't water them at all unless you have a really long dry period and people are talking about it. More on winter care though. Before new growth starts, cut the dead growth back. I could have cut a little bit more there, but that'll all disappear soon after this sedge begins to grow. I'm going to run you through the steps here on replacing soil in the pot. And you want to do this before new growth starts because, well, you need to turn the pot upside down pretty much to get the plant out, and that would make it rough on any new growth, green growth. So in this pot, I haven't changed soil until this year. It's probably been 3 or 4 years. And there's about, soil was down about 4 inches. So I took a few pictures here to explain what happened. The one on the left, I turned the pot upside down, and that's how it looked from the bottom side. That white spot in the middle is a root that broke off that had gone through the pot and into the ground underneath. I ruffled up the roots a little bit, but I didn't cut them off. And I turned it back over, and that second picture, you can see new, very pale white growth coming up. There are about 3 shoots, I think, maybe 4. There's usually 4 that come up every year. So then in the third picture, I added soil to the bottom of the pot, and I got real dirt in there, plus a little bit of potting soil. So I dropped the root ball in, and of course it went down too far, and so I had to take it out about 2 more times, I think, before I got the depth of the soil right. So after you get the depth right, on the right-hand side there, because you've raised that root ball up, there's a space around the edge now. You have to fill that back in with dirt, and it doesn't work to just pour some around the edges. You've got to push it down in with a stick. So that's what that bamboo stick is there for. And I took probably 3 or 4 or 5 minutes getting that tamped down good all the way around. So this is the pot after it's been planted, and I put enough soil back on the top to make those stems disappear. I took the sedum, the green plants there. There was a few of those left. I took those and scattered them around, and probably by the end of the summer, each plant will be about 4 inches across and hanging over the edge. This pot you saw earlier, is 17 years old. When I bought it, I paid about, I'm not sure, but probably around $50 for it. So if I can get it to go 3 more years before that hairline crack in there gets out of hand and the pot falls apart, I'll have $2.50 per year invested in keeping this vine growing and enjoying it out where we eat every day when it's in bloom in the summer, and we get to watch bumblebees come and use it. So plants in pots do benefit the environment in addition to us. And still on winter care, there are some southern species like American beautyberry, native bamboo, and the 2 passion flowers that they need some serious winter protection. So I really don't advise you to use them in pots. If you did, you'd have to bring them in somewhere through the winter and keep them cool, but not warm and growing. And also just enjoy your container gardens in the winter. You can tell wind direction, if you got the right plant. This is prairie drop seed, and I intended on that first slide well, I'm sure you all remember seeing it. The prairie drop seed there had a starburst effect, green blades going up, and it was taken about the end of May, I believe, the picture. By the end of the summer, the foliage will be down to the base like it is here, and longer. So this is February, the same pot. I've got 3 pictures here, these 2, and then this one. This is February 2013 in a snowstorm. Every time I look at that, I think, boy, I sure do need to braid that hair. So now let's talk about water pots. There's 2 ways of doing them, and I've so far only done one way, the one on the left, but let's look at the one on the right for a second. That's a pot, big pot that holds water, and it's got at least, I would say, 3 smaller pots inside, maybe setting up on bricks or something to get the height right for the pot. But each plant in there is in a separate pot. That's one way of doing it. It makes it easy for disassembling the pot in the winter, because if you left that pot through the winter outside, the water would freeze and it would break the pot. There's even this pot, I'm sure, because there's a little bit of small constriction at the top, and the pressure of the ice would break it. The ice wouldn't go up as it froze, it would go out. The pot on the left, and this is the way I do them, and I'm going to show you the steps here in a second, but put dirt in the pot itself, and it's real dirt, not potting soil, because you'd have a smelly mess with all that organic material decomposing if you did try to use organic potting soil. So you've got about soil in there up to about 2 or 3 inches from the top. Put a plant in, and it takes off growing. That plant had been in there for probably all of June, and from a single 1 to 2 leaves in a pot that it was used to put in there. So here's how I did a pot. I hauled this in potting soil and fertilizer and a plant over to the Shaw Nature Reserve several years ago, 2010, and with their permission, put it on the front porch. And I added soil to the pot. Somewhere down towards the bottom, I put probably close to a pint of that. It was composted turkey litter is what it was. It wasn't really strong fertilizer. You could use chemical fertilizer, could use time release, you could use triple 13 or something like that, if you know what I'm talking about. If you did that, you would want to put it in a couple of layers of newspaper about 8 inches square, and fold it, about a tablespoon of it, up in the paper, make a little ball out of it, twist the loose ends around, and bury that in the soil. And 1 would probably be enough to get it through the summer. So I added the dirt up to about 3 or 4 inches from the top, and put the plant in, and I put gravel on the surface, and then I added water, and the water got dirty, so that gravel really didn't keep the dirt from coming to the surface. The water clears up in just a few days when you make one of these, so I almost never put gravel or anything else in there besides the dirt. So this was on May 10th. I left it, took my bucket with me, came back 19 days later, and this is how it looked. Yeah, they might not have watered it during that period, but at any rate, it wasn't dead, and I'm sure they kept it watered. So it was growing some algae, that's fine. And by now you're probably wondering, what about mosquitoes? Well, if it does dry down every 10 days or so, you don't have mosquitoes. I usually put a mosquito dunk, which has a bacteria, I believe, that kills mosquito larvae. And I should know the name of it, but sorry. Winter care before a hard freeze. You want to empty that pot because it's going to freeze and break. I mentioned that earlier. So that's what I do with them in the winter. And usually that happens about, 8 hours or so before the hard freeze, because I get it on the day that it's going to freeze that night and probably break the pot if I don't take it apart. Procrastination. Now, that seems like a lot of trouble it's really worth the effort to do all of that in a pot, a pretty pot above ground. But if you want to be a little more lax in the procedure, you could bury a pot in the ground, holds water. This is plastic one, and we have Arrow Arum in this one. I'll show you a picture of Arrow Arum in a minute. We haven't put the fertilizer in this, and the plant usually doesn't do all that well, and it's really in a pot too small for the plant. So here's another. I went over 3 years later to the Shaw Nature Reserve, and they had my pot out there on the front porch. They had put a pickerel weed in it and some kind of a rush, I think. And I took advantage of this to say that, to emphasize again that plants, water plants in water pots like this really eat up the fertilizer. They really need the nitrogen. And I think these are starting to turn yellow. And here's one that's not. This was taken in 2008 at the nursery. And that was probably been in there 3 months, I believe. It was doing really well. These plants are great for bumblebees, and I believe hummingbirds use them. So this is the Arrow Arum that I showed you earlier in that little pot buried in the ground. I had a big one we had in a greenhouse that had started growing, and that's what I planted on around May 4th, probably in 2013. And then in August 5th, not doing the math right now, but 3 or 4 months later, it was really going gangbusters. It doesn't spread like Arrowhead does all through the pot. It's clump forming, and it's related to Jack in the Pulpit and green dragon. So it's got a flower that looks a lot like a green dragon flower, and there's a bunch of them in there, the darker green pointed structures under those leaves. And a few more aquatic plants. Aquatic milkweed would work fine. You could put cardinal flower in the water and it would flower, but it would probably die by the next year if you had it in the water. It did for me when I did it, but I haven't tried it any more than that. I've heard other people say they had them in water, but I haven't heard the story about whether they survived. Lizard's tail is one I haven't done, and but it's a good plant, and it would work. The field horsetail pictured here, we had that in the pot for a long time. I might still have it in that pot, but it's a plant that you don't really submerge in the water, but we have it in a saucer of water, and we can't keep enough water in it to take care of its needs. So the last year we had it in that saucer, we had it die back, I think, 3 times. It dies all the way to the ground, cut the dead stuff off, and next thing you know, it's up looking about like it is in this picture. And I've done water canna, and it's great. It grows a lot, it gets big. It's almost too big for the pots. It'll press against the sides pretty good and fill it up, but it looks good, and the hummingbirds use it. One more time, winterize those ceramic water pots. And now we're going to look at a few pictures. It's my time. A little bit more here. A few pictures of plants that will grow in those holy containers, the ones with holes in the bottoms. Purple tassels is one that I'm enthused about again. I want to try it using that limestone gravel in the bottom of the pot. It hasn't done well in a pot with just our soil, potting soil. The reason I'd like to see it work is the picture on the right is, well, it's in October. It blooms in June, and it's related to prairie clover, white and purple, but it tends to spread across the ground and hug the ground. So I'm pretty sure it would hang over a pot and would look pretty neat. This is oak sedge in 2009, April and October, the same plant. It blooms first and then the leaves come out, but it's a neat plant. It dies back through the winter mostly. This is my oldest pot. I started out with 2005. I've still got it. I think maybe the silky aster has died. I think the rest of them are still growing, and it's taken on an extra one, some kind of a carrick species. What I learned from this pot is that plants are like goldfish in a goldfish bowl. If you put a lot of them in there, they don't get big. And the one that I would like to see get big is the threadleaf blue star. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. This is fall glade onion with the threadleaf blue star foliage. I've pulled a lot of plants, I'm sure, with using that picture. This is what threadleaf blue star should look like if it's doing really well in the ground. And if you had a big enough pot, it would get close to that size. And the picture there, the flowers are on the right. That pot that I showed you, it's never flowered. Threadleaf blue star has never flowered in that pot, so it's too crowded. I'll go through at least one set of pictures here and maybe quit. We'll find out in a minute. This is a pot that I started in 2007, 3 species in it, and they were smaller species, so they weren't a problem. They were fine. They were big goldfish. But the fire pink was good for 1 year and then it died. So it got really big, but the next year it wasn't there. Let's see, that's 2008. This is 2012. Either I put a Sweet William in it or Sweet William got into that space and did real well for a few years. But in this picture, you can see towards the left, the beginnings of garden phlox starting to take over, starting to grow. And here it is, back up, 2012, 2013, it was going gangbusters, and that was a good year for it. And then 2 years later, it had outgrown the pot. It just competed with itself so much that it didn't even flower. So I gave up on the pot at that point. I don't see any of the other plants in there. So it sort of took up the space. So it lasted 8 years. This is that questionable little flower alum root again. Heuchera parviflora. It works great in a pot. The foliage, any heuchera works great in a pot. They stay somewhat green foliage through the winter. This is the leather flower, the big clay pot. That's what the flowers look like. The bumblebees go in the base of the flower there and get the nectar. I have pictures of that happening, but sorry, I don't have it here. Dittany is a neat one to have in a pot, because in the fall they make the frost flowers, if you know what that is. If you don't, you can see them on Facebook or look them up. I can't explain it at this point here. Prairie pussy toes is a good one as a ground cover. That only gets about an inch tall. And I've had it with harebell before in a pot, and the two have gone along pretty good. Harebell doesn't do well if I put it in a garden situation, or I haven't had a dry enough place for it. I should put it that way. That's another one that grows on limestone, out of limestone rocks in Missouri. So it might benefit from more limestone in the pot. This is rock pink and prickly pear. We've looked at the rock pink before. If I ended up selling that pot, I'm sure, or someone sold it while I was gone one day. But if I had the prickly pear in that pot very long, I think I would be removing pads, which is easy to do. You just take a hold of a pad and twist it 360 degrees and it'll break off probably before that twist is complete. This pot, keep going. I'll keep going.
You can keep going.
I'm sorry.
You can keep going.
All right. This is a pot I did in 2006. No, 2007 in the spring. Nope. 2006 in the spring. And I'm confused. I started it in 2007 in the spring, and that's how it looked in the fall. It had these species. And I had them in, I had the pot going for a lot of years. I took the Virginia creeper out though, I think after the first year, because I didn't want it to get out of hand in there. The Solomon seal is one that lasted for a long time. The Jacob's ladder came and went, reseeding in, and wild stone crop sedum, it was very successful. Hit the wrong button. This was it. Can't read the date, but anyway, a few years later, and you can see two species in there, Solomon seal and Jacob's ladder. I gave up on it and replanted it and put 3 or 4 species in it, and the next year this is how it looked. And that was last year. I've got this year, it's just going to be columbine the way it looks, with about four columbines they seeded in. But that's hummingbirds use that all while it's blooming. So plants and pots really do interact. This is sandflocks on the left. It was supposed to be with some blue wild indigo in a big pot, and blue wild indigo is struggling. So it might be my potting soil being too wet because I'm using our real soil. And then I've got a water garden here, a water plant on the right, water canna and arrowhead. And this is the end, unless you want to look at more pictures at after this. Hello?
That's fine. We have plenty of questions coming in on the chat, so.
Okay.
So if you're ready for questions, sorry, I was in the middle of responding to somebody, but we have some good questions to get started if you're ready.
Go for it.
Perfect, sorry. So we have a lot of questions about the water pots. A lot of folks wanted to know about overwintering. One, where do you put those plants that you might be taking out of water pots to save those pots? And so that was the kind of the gist of the questions we were getting.
Yeah. Well, good question. If you have a water garden somewhere, that would be a place where you just plunk them down in there. We have water beds here that we grow our plants in, and they're, the important thing is that they don't break the pot, that the pot doesn't break. So it could be that if you have a way to getting more, you just start them from new plants the following year. I mean, unfortunately, that's the only way I've really done it. I've released water canna in my pond before because it got so big. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to overwinter. You can keep some of them. Water canna is going to die if it isn't in 5 inches or more of water through the winter. In central Missouri anyway, it's native to southeast Missouri. So, but I think Julian Starmark talked about people keeping them in greenhouses or in a house growing through the winter, but it would have to be a very sunny location if you did. And keep in mind, it's just going to keep on growing, so it's going to need some attention as it crowds the edge of the pot.
I mean, I think that's all good and fair answer responses to that. We had other questions we had several questions about soil. And one of those was, what about using soil from our yards if it happens to be heavy clay soil, which a lot of us have? Would you recommend folks use that or no?
Well, yeah, I'm using soil that is pretty heavy. Well, if it was wet, I could probably make pottery out of it, but not quite. In other words, it's heavy on the clay side, but it's still got silt and whatever the other part is, sand and silt. I used a pile of dirt that we had that when we built the pond, they had extra dirt and they plunked it out there on the ground, and we've been slowly using it up. And yeah, it's a combination of all of sand, silt, and clay, but still heavy on the clay side. I think you're okay.
All right, good. So there are a lot of questions then following up about, you kind of touched on it at the beginning, but folks are asking about that real soil versus potting mix. If you could kind of just refresh everybody's memory on that, what you said earlier.
You mean what our potting soil is, or?
Yeah, like people are wondering, yeah, what about using that, or what do you mean by real dirt versus?
Oh, mineral soil, that clay, that sand, silt, and clay, the stuff that's not organic. It's broken up rocks down to really tiny particles. Yeah, that's what I mean by real dirt.
Great.
Yeah.
And so we had some last year we had a presentation about soil, and so someone asked about, are there concerns about pH that one should have with containers, or the soil pH in our containers?
Yeah.
That gets
going back to that question about clay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't stuff clay in a pot and then try to grow a plant in it. I would make it be a mix of, sand, silt, and clay. And there's nothing wrong with adding some organic potting soil to it, just not 100%. Now your question.
So so there's a question about the pH.
The pH. Yeah. Well, I'll quote. Well, first of all, I'd never worry about pH, because the plants will grow. To quote Neil DeBall in a meeting program he did once, the plants grow in a range of pH from 7.5 to 5.5, I believe. And then so 6.5 is a good point to be in between. But they grow, if I always say, if the plants are growing in it, you're okay. And there's very few plants that are so specific that they have to have acid or basic. I mean, even though we find them in those acid places or the basic places, many of them are very tolerant.
And so there was a good question about how do you decide on the pot size for your container plants?
If you knew the size of the mature plant and somehow matched it to that, thinking about the size of the plant when it's mature, think about how a 5 or a 6 inch diameter pot, which I would consider a small pot, would look with a mature purple coneflower growing in it. That's pushing my limits on wildflowers to grow in a pot, maybe, but in other words, it's going to need a good size, what I would call a large pot, which I do have in that handout that you sent out. I hope the spreadsheet, it's got a description of pot sizes there, small, medium, and large, and that would be a guide to go by.
Great. Yes, we did send that out, and for folks who joined us a bit later, I did put my email in the chat. So if you didn't see it, if it ended up in your spam folder or something, that you can email me to ask for it. We'll send it out again though with the link for the recording too. So you'll have that nice list with so we have a lot of questions about what grows well in shade and that sort of thing. And I think that's all in that spreadsheet as well, right, Mervin? Like
pretty good. Most, if you have my catalog, or you can see it on our website, but which is right there in front of you on the screen if you see it. The catalog the pictures in the catalog are in there on shade or sun and all of that, so you can find them pretty easily in the catalog, and in the selection guide it tells you also ones that like shade.
Sure. Sorry, I just wanted to mention I did put the link from the Partners for Native Landscaping page about the plant fair, and so there's a link there to the part. So people can click on it too.
If you were out of the shade species, the celandine poppy, I was going to show that one and I didn't. Celandine poppy is good. Jacob's ladder is good. I haven't done the obviously the Indian pink is good, but I've not been successful yet. I'm going to be.
I like that. I like that determination. So we we get a lot of questions like that, but that handout is super helpful, and we will have a program on shade plants too coming up, so you can take a look at the list of the webinars still to come. Also, we did have a question. We've had a lot of questions about the pots themselves. So besides the size, there was a question, maybe this kind of goes hand in hand, about plastic pots. Are those, should we be using those for our container gardening of native plants? And what might that mean, or is something we could take into consideration with that the colder temperatures? Should we be worried about freezing, the soil freezing during the winter if we have overwintering plants?
Well, keep in mind that no matter what pots you're using in the winter and it's outside, soil is going to be about the same temperature as the outside temperature. They're going to freeze, and that's okay. They can handle that. If they're underground in the soil, then they won't get quite as cold. But that's the purpose of putting the pot on the ground instead of or concrete or patio or whatever, instead of putting them up on a table. I lost a couple of plants on a table a few years ago, and that's why I say that. So I really don't, our plants at the nursery, we grow everything in plastic pots that are smaller, and they freeze. They get a little protection in unheated greenhouses, but there was a time when we didn't have hardly any of them in a greenhouse, and they still survived, almost all of them.
Great.
80, they're hardy.
I was gonna say that's the plus side, right? That's one of the strong benefits is that they know how to handle our crazy winters.
They're not annual bedding plants.
That's right. So also, there have been several questions about transferring the potted plants to the ground. You mentioned that you had one that you had to stop trying to you had it for I think 8 years. You said you finally had to
Yeah, I gave it away.
Oh, that's how you gave up.
But you could cut it up in pieces and plant a whole bunch of them, and you'd just be cutting chunks up. And I mean, it's a very prolific plant and easy to grow. If you were to do that when it was actually when it was actively growing, to transplant it, you would want to cut the top off mostly, and then it'll survive. A lot of people make that mistake and try to water the heck out of a plant after they've destroyed most of the root system to keep the plant blooming if they dig it in bloom. So
oh yeah, so you'd want to cut it back so they wouldn't have to
have equal damage above ground as you have below ground.
Yeah. That's very helpful information, I'm sure, for folks. I'll first admit I don't have a garden of my own because I don't have the place to do it, but and I don't even have a place to have a container garden right now outside. So but I'm going to work on that. But so that's really interesting and good information for everybody. And so let me just check in here to make sure we got a lot more questions coming in. And I do want to just reiterate that if you're interested in I had somebody ask about the plant list for the fair. There's information about the plant sale on April 30th. And you can see which vendors are going to be have plants available, and you can click on those links. But any information about that right now is on the website. So I did put that link in the chat, and I can again. So I just wanted to make sure I said that. And a couple people have their hands up in the virtual hands up. And so if you have questions, please put those in the chat. But or if it's just a wave, thank you. We'll wave back. So someone asked about, you mentioned Campanula earlier, and they said they didn't see it on the plant list. And so they were just curious, I think, because it was maybe they thought it was in one of the photos. And so I just wanted to ask that question since it was this.
I'm sorry, what species?
The Campanula, I think it is what they typed in the
companion. Oh, the bellflower.
Yes.
And what now I'm back to what's the question?
So the
Sorry.
question is, they didn't see it on, should that be on the plant list that was shared out, or?
Oh, it's probably not on there, actually. I don't know. I don't have it in front of me, but it's probably not. Because partly because it's not real common that we have huge numbers of them to sell, and so it's just a species that's not going to be out there in the market very much, probably.
Okay, good to know. And good question. And I think that this question has come up before, and not necessarily during this webinar series last year, but in other programs that the library's hosted about where to find native plants. And it is hard because you guys, it takes work to create the stock, right, to do this. So
Oh, you mean where I find them, where I get them? Is that
well,
what?
just in general, I think like, obviously you guys are out there doing the work, but that not every single Missouri plant is going to be available because somebody has to go out there and and collect them and propagate them. And so it's just an interesting, a good thing to keep in mind, I guess, for folks.
It's yeah, there's a lot of the species that are sold in Missouri, native species. A lot of the other nurseries, several of the other nurseries get seed from us. And we're glad to make it available so that we've got Missouri source out there. But it is possible to purchase plants that have a genetic origin way off somewhere else in the United States. But
All right, well, good. Thank you for that. And so someone was asking about the plant list again, so I just want to make sure everybody knows that they can, if they can't wait till tomorrow when the link goes out with the recording and the handout again, you can email me, and I'm putting my email in the chat once more. Someone asked about, we get a lot of questions. We're not really talking much about the kind of past sorts of questions we get, because we do get a lot about how to keep things out of our yards and that sort of thing. But you mentioned the mosquito dunks, and someone asked about like, are they safe for tadpoles, and how do we, so maybe just a brief moment about how striking the balance between kind of keeping our yard, I guess, pleasant or even safe for us and for the animals around us. So you have any thoughts about that?
You're stretching the limits of my knowledge, and I should know it.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Well, that's
because I think I've seen things going both ways on that. I want to say the name of the bacteria. I can't come up with it. And yeah, that's something I need to find out. And
that's a question that I, as a librarian, or a response that I, as a librarian, appreciate.
Yeah.
So it's good to.
I can check into it and let you know.
We have someone who says bacteria thuringiensis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm copying and pasting that response. So hopefully everyone sees that and who's interested. So good question there, or good things to keep in mind. But yeah, due diligence on our own parts. So sometimes we have to figure out what's right for us, right? What's a good balance for what.
It's a natural thing, a naturally occurring thing, control. The question is, does it control other things? And that's what the person was mentioning about the tadpoles. And I don't have the answer off the top of my head on that.
Now everybody has got that info to, someone else said bacillus. Okay, so that as well. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so places to start investigating. As a librarian, I like that. So we can do more research of our own. All right. So I think things are going along pretty well here with the questions. Oh, somebody did ask about, they said on one of the slides, they noticed there was a mention of southern species. Does that mean that it's not a Missouri native, or did everything we talk about?
No, I'm sorry. I sell species that are native to Missouri, within the state of Missouri. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of species along the southern edge of the state that you don't find in the northern part of the state. And the one of those that I mentioned was the American beautyberry. And it grows all over St. Louis and Kansas City because we've sold lots of plants in those two places. So they're surviving farther north than the natural range. I mean, Arkansas line is literally the natural, the uppermost range of it. One of the eastern states, I think it might be a little bit higher in latitude, but I'm not certain. And it's but we have available the northernmost, and yet it's still limited by its ability to, they just won't live in a pot through the winter. They freeze. But they are native here, though all of those species are.
It's nice to be reminded that as much as we feel, I mean, I guess we know that the state isn't homogeneous in terms of populations and things like that, but also that goes out to plants too, that they're going to be different things that maybe we're not used to seeing here, but that doesn't mean it doesn't grow in Missouri.
That's one of the neat things about Missouri and its plants is native plants is we're located in a place where the boundary of the state goes into a whole lot of different natural communities, habitats. So north to south and east and west, both.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the reason why it's such a beautiful place, if you ask me. And let's see. So I think we're kind of getting down onto the wire here on the kind of more general questions. So thank you all for great responses. There were a lot of responses about the Bacillus thuringiensis, and that it seems to maybe target other kinds of like insects or caterpillars, but the tadpoles might be okay. So just things to keep in mind. So thanks, Hivebind, for for sharing some insights to at least to send us off with. And we have lots of compliments, Mervin, on all your beautiful photos. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. Let me say real quick, there is a bladderwort is a naturally occurring plant that we have here at the nursery. We give it away when people ask for it, but it grows in water and it creates little bladders that capture submerged insects, and mosquito larvae is one of the things that it eats. It's carnivorous.
Right.
It's pretty neat. If you go on YouTube, you can find it in action.
I love it. I'll have to look for that. Because again, like carnivorous plants, I don't really think about Missouri having carnivorous plants, but I'm sure, yeah, of course we do, but we just don't hear about it very often. So thank you. I'm sure my daughter will love to investigate the YouTube about that later.
But you can put that in your water and it'll grow really fast and pretty much control the mosquito larvae, I think.
Wonderful. First time I've heard that, so thank you so much. Well, I mean, in general, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing all your knowledge and experience about growing these kinds of things in containers of all kinds. And we really appreciate it. We were getting lots of thank yous in the in the chat, and you can see all the reactions there too. Our St. Louis County Library patrons are really big on the Zoom little emojis and things, which are nice to not feel so.
Is that what's floating up here on my screen?
Yep, those are people sending you hearts and applause and all kinds of things. So thank you, everybody. And I just want to remind you once again that we have a survey link that I'll put one more time tonight in the chat, and it will be coming out to you in emails. If you don't have time tonight to fill it out, you can do so at some point. We hope to hear how you enjoyed this evening's program. And then we'll have the recording link to our YouTube channel. It'll take you right to this, as well as the PDF of the handout Mervin shared that has a listing of plants and with all kinds of good information on it. So thank you all for your great questions. Thank you, Mervin, for your really thorough and knowledgeable presentation. We really appreciate it. And we hope
Thank you.
Thanks, Mervin. Have a great night, everyone.